At 7:55 on the morning of April 16, 1947, Rudolf Höss stepped out of a transport vehicle at the main gate of Auschwitz concentration camp. He was 46 years old, and he was returning to the place where he had murdered more than 1 million people. The morning was cold. A light rain fell on the gravel paths he had once walked as a master of this kingdom of death. The watchtower still stood. The barbed wire still stretched between concrete posts. The red brick buildings of Auschwitz rose against the grey Polish sky, exactly as he had left them. But everything had changed. Höss wore a plain grey suit instead of his SS uniform. His hands were bound behind his back instead of clasped behind him in inspection, and the men walking beside him were not subordinates. They were Polish guards escorting him to the gallows. In his breast pocket was a photograph of his wife Hedwig and their 5 children. He had carried it throughout his imprisonment. The children, Klaus, Heidetraut, Ingebrigit, Hans-Jürgen and Annegret, had played in the garden of the Commandant's villa, while 200 meters away the chimneys of the crematoria filled the sky with ash. What Höss did not know, as he walked toward the execution site, was that the gallows had been erected specifically for him, just meters from his former home. He would die within sight of the windows where his children had slept. He would die in Auschwitz. He was coming home. The promise had been made 2 years earlier in a courtroom far from Poland. On April 15, 1946, at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, American prosecutor Colonel John Harlan Amen addressed the court. Rudolf Höss had just finished testifying, 3 days of calm, methodical description of mass murder. He had explained the gas chambers, the crematoria, the selection process. He had spoken of killing as an administrative problem to be solved. The courtroom had listened in horrified silence. "The defendant has described," Amen said, his voice tight with controlled fury, "the murder of approximately 1,100,000 human beings, men, women, and children, gassed, burned, erased. Back to Auschwitz." That phrase had not yet been spoken, but everyone in the courtroom understood what justice required. Gustawa Wenicka, a Polish survivor who had lost her entire family in the camp, sat in the gallery. She watched Höss testify with the same expressionless efficiency he had once used to run the death factory. "He spoke of us like cargo," she said later, "like shipments to be processed. I knew then that he had to die where we had died. Nowhere else would be right." The Nuremberg tribunal could not execute Höss. He was a witness, not a defendant, but Poland had requested his extradition. Poland would try him. Poland would hang him, and Poland would do it in Auschwitz. Rudolf Höss had not always been a mass murderer. He had been a farmer, a soldier, a father. The transformation from ordinary man to architect of genocide had taken 20 years. Born in 1900 in Baden-Baden, Germany, Höss was raised in a strict Catholic household. His father, a former army officer, intended him for the priesthood. Instead, at 15, Höss volunteered for the German army in World War I. He served in Turkey and Palestine, was wounded 3 times, and returned home a decorated veteran. The war had changed him. The faith of his childhood was gone, replaced by something harder. In 1922, he joined the Nazi Party, member number 3240. In 1923, he participated in the murder of a schoolteacher suspected of betraying a Nazi activist. He served 5 years in prison for the killing. After his release, Höss drifted into farming, married Hedwig Hensel, and might have disappeared into obscurity. But Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, was building a new organization, one that would require men capable of following orders without moral hesitation. In 1934, Höss joined the SS and was assigned to Dachau concentration camp. He learned the system: roll calls, punishments, executions. He watched prisoners beaten to death and felt nothing. His superiors noticed his efficiency. By 1938, he was adjutant at Sachsenhausen. By May 1940, he was commandant of a new camp being constructed in occupied Poland, a place called Auschwitz. The original camp was designed for Polish political prisoners, but in the summer of 1941, Höss received new orders from Himmler himself. Auschwitz would become something unprecedented, an industrial facility for the extermination of European Jews. Himmler told me, Höss wrote in his memoirs, that the Führer had ordered the final solution of the Jewish question. I was to carry it out. Höss approached genocide as an engineering problem. He tested Zyklon B gas on Soviet prisoners. He designed larger gas chambers. He expanded the crematoria. When bodies piled up faster than furnaces could burn them, he ordered open-air burning pits. By 1944, Auschwitz was killing 6,000 people per day. And through it all, Höss lived with his family in a comfortable villa beside the camp. His children played in a garden fertilized with human ash. His wife complained about the smell from the crematoria when the wind shifted. He was, by every account, a loving father and devoted husband. He read bedtime stories to his children while 500 meters away, other children walked into gas chambers. This was the horror of Rudolf Höss. Not that he was a monster, but that he was ordinary. When the war ended, Rudolf Höss disappeared. In April 1945, as Allied forces closed on Germany, Höss shed his SS uniform and assumed a false identity. He became Franz Lang, a farm laborer. He found work on an agricultural estate near Flensburg in northern Germany. He grew a beard. He avoided cities. He waited. For 11 months it worked. British war crimes investigators knew Höss was alive. His name appeared throughout captured Nazi documents. They interrogated his wife Hedwig, who insisted she did not know where her husband was. They searched farms, checked records, found nothing. Then, in March 1946, a breakthrough. British intelligence intercepted a letter Hedwig had written, hinting at her husband's location. On March 11, 1946, a team of British soldiers surrounded a farmhouse near Gottrupel. They found Höss in the barn, dressed in peasant clothes, pretending to be a farmhand. He denied his identity. The soldiers were not convinced. Captain William Cross, leading the arrest team, ordered Höss stripped. On his left arm they found what they were looking for, the blood group tattoo that all SS members carried. Höss was caught, but he still refused to talk. The interrogation that followed was brutal. British soldiers beat Höss for 3 days. They deprived him of sleep. They threatened his family. Finally, on March 14th, Höss broke. He signed a confession admitting his role as Commandant of Auschwitz. I commanded Auschwitz until December 1943, the confession read, and estimate that at least 2,500,000 victims were executed and exterminated there by gassing and burning. The number was too high. Later estimates placed the death toll at approximately 1.1 million. But the confession was genuine. Rudolf Höss, the architect of industrial murder, was finally in custody. He would testify at Nuremberg. He would be extradited to Poland, and he would return to Auschwitz, not as commandant, but as condemned, back to Auschwitz. The journey was almost complete. At Nuremberg, Rudolf Höss made a decision that shocked the world. He told the truth. Unlike other Nazi defendants who denied, deflected, and blamed subordinates, Höss calmly described exactly what he had done. He explained the selection process, how doctors chose who would live and who would die. He detailed the gas chambers, how long it took victims to die, how the bodies were processed. He discussed numbers, how many transports arrived, how many people were killed each day. He showed no remorse. He expressed no guilt. He simply answered questions with the same bureaucratic precision he had once used to manage mass murder. "I was trained to obey orders without thinking," Höss testified. "The thought of disobeying never occurred to me." The defense attorneys for other Nazi leaders were horrified. Höss's testimony demolished their claims of ignorance. If the Commandant of Auschwitz knew exactly what he was doing, how could anyone claim not to know? On May 25, 1946, Höss was transferred to Poland. The government in Warsaw had demanded his extradition. Auschwitz was on Polish soil, and Poland would try him for crimes against the Polish nation. The trial began in Warsaw on March 11, 1947, exactly 1 year after his capture. It lasted 2 weeks. The verdict was never in doubt. On April 2, 1947, Rudolf Höss was sentenced to death. The sentence would be carried out at Auschwitz. Back to Auschwitz. The prophecy was about to be fulfilled. While Höss awaited execution, he wrote, in his cell in Krakow, with paper provided by Polish authorities, he composed his memoirs, page after page of neat handwriting describing his childhood, his career, his years at Auschwitz. He wrote about his wife and children with tenderness. He wrote about killing with detachment. "I was not suited for the work," Höss wrote. "I was too soft, but I had to carry out the orders I received." At the same moment, across Poland, survivors were trying to rebuild shattered lives. Tadeusz Bohowski, a Polish writer who had survived Auschwitz, was working on a collection of short stories about the camp. Unlike Höss's memoirs, Borowski's work captured the horror from inside, the selections, the crematoria, the daily struggle to survive. His stories would become classics of Holocaust literature. Borowski knew Höss was awaiting execution. "It is not enough," he wrote to a friend. "Nothing is enough, but it is something." In April 1947, as the execution date approached, survivors began traveling to Auschwitz. Some had been liberated barely 2 years earlier. Some still bore the numbers tattooed on their arms. They came to witness the end of the man who had tried to end them. Gustawa Winnicke, who had watched Höss testify at Nuremberg, made the journey from Warsaw. She brought a photograph of her parents, her husband, her 2 children, all murdered in the camp. She intended to show them to Höss before he died. She never got the chance. Polish authorities limited witness access to the execution. Only officials and journalists would be permitted to watch. On the morning of April 16th, Höss was woken at 5 a.m. He was given a final meal. He barely touched it. A Catholic priest offered last rites. Höss, who had abandoned his faith decades earlier, declined. At 7 a.m., he was transported from Krakow to Auschwitz. The drive took 90 minutes. Höss sat in silence, watching the Polish countryside pass outside the window. At 8 o'clock, he arrived at the main gate, the same gate through which over 1 million people had passed on their way to death. Above it, the iron letters still spelled out the camp's infamous slogan, "Arbeit macht frei." Work sets you free. The gallows waited near Crematorium Fire. It was a simple wooden structure, 2 uprights, a crossbeam, a trapdoor. Behind it stood the Commandant's villa, where Hedwig Höss had once tended her garden. Approximately 200 witnesses had gathered. Polish officials, journalists, survivors selected by lottery. They stood in silence as Höss was led to the scaffold. At 10:08, Rudolf Höss climbed the wooden steps to the gallows platform. His hands were bound behind his back. His face was pale but composed. He had maintained his bureaucratic calm throughout, the same calm he had shown while signing death warrants, while watching selections, while overseeing the murder of 1 million human beings. The executioner was a Polish prisoner named Stanisław Reznik. He had volunteered for the task. His family had died in the camps. Höss was positioned over the trapdoor. The noose was placed around his neck. A Polish official asked if he had any last words. Höss turned his head slightly, looking toward his former villa. His children had been evacuated years ago. Hedwig had taken them west before the Soviet advance. They would never see their father again. They would grow up with a different name, hiding from the legacy he had created. "Long live Poland," Höss said. His voice was flat, emotionless. Some witnesses believed he was mocking them. Others thought he was attempting a final futile gesture of submission. The truth died with him. At 10:12, the trapdoor opened. Rudolf Höss dropped. The rope snapped taut. His body convulsed once, twice, then hung still. The official time of death was recorded as 10:21, 9 minutes after the drop. The witnesses stood in silence. There was no cheering, no celebration. The moment was too heavy for that. Gustawa Winnicke, watching from behind the barrier, clutched her photograph of her murdered family. She had wanted Höss to see their faces before he died. Instead, she watched him die without ever acknowledging them. "I felt nothing," she said later. "I thought I would feel something. Relief, justice, closure. But there was nothing. He was dead and my family was still dead. Nothing had changed. The body was left hanging for 1 hour. Photographers documented the scene. Then Höss was cut down, loaded into a wooden coffin, and taken away for cremation. His ashes were scattered in an unmarked location. There would be no grave, no memorial, no place for admirers to gather. Rudolf Höss would be erased, as he had tried to erase so many others. Back to Auschwitz, the journey was complete. In the weeks before his death, Rudolf Höss had written something that suggested he finally understood what he had done. "My conscience compels me to make the following declaration," he wrote in his memoirs. "In the solitude of my prison cell, I have come to the bitter recognition that I have sinned gravely against humanity." Was it genuine remorse, or simply the words of a man trying to salvage some dignity before death? Historians have debated the question for decades. What is certain is that Höss never fully grasped the magnitude of his crimes. In his memoirs, he complained about the stress of his job, the difficulty of managing so many deaths, the toll it took on his nerves. He wrote of victims as problems to be solved, not as human beings who suffered. Even at the end, standing on the gallows, he showed no visible emotion. The bureaucrat died as he had lived, efficient, orderly, hollow. He had returned to Auschwitz, but he had never truly understood what Auschwitz meant. Hedwig Höss and her children survived the war. They changed their name, moved to a small town in Germany, and disappeared into anonymity. The children grew up knowing what their father had done. Some spoke about it publicly, others never did. Brigitte Höss, the eldest daughter, gave interviews late in life in which she struggled to reconcile the loving father she remembered with the mass murderer the world condemned. "He was a good father to us," she said. "That is the truth, but it is not the whole truth." The villa at Auschwitz still stands. After the war, it was used as offices, then as housing for museum staff. Today, it is not open to the public. The garden where the host children played has been preserved, a silent reminder that ordinary life continued within sight of the gas chambers. Auschwitz itself became a museum and memorial in 1947, the same year Höss was executed. Over 2 million people visit each year. The gallows where Höss died was removed after the execution. But the site is marked. Visitors can stand where he stood, look at the villa where he lived, and try to comprehend the incomprehensible. History remembers Rudolf Höss as one of the greatest mass murderers in human history, and he was. Over 1 million people died under his command, more than any single individual in history had ever killed. But Höss was also a warning. He was not a madman. He was not a sadist. He was an ordinary man who followed orders, who valued efficiency, who loved his family while destroying the families of others. The greatest evil, wrote Hannah Arendt, is the evil committed by nobodies. Höss was proof of that terrible truth. He had the capacity for murder because he lacked the capacity to question. Today, the execution site at Auschwitz is preserved as part of the memorial. A simple plaque marks the spot where the gallows stood. Visitors pause there, looking from the crematorium to the villa and back again, trying to understand how such evil could exist in such an ordinary place. But the lesson of Rudolf Höss endures. Back to Auschwitz. He built a factory of death and died within its walls. He murdered 1 million people and was buried in no grave. He believed he was following orders, and history judged him a monster. Some journeys end where they began. Some crimes can only be answered in the place where they were committed. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Krakow to California, from survivors to students. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.